Hey guys, still no catchphrase for me, but this time I'm going to try to actually keep it under 10 minutes. I have a clock next to me and I should just get right into it because otherwise I'll talk too long. The other day you guys looked at fighting in Vietnam. What a positive and joyful experience that is. I'm kidding, of course. Today you guys are going to look at the growing unpopularity of Vietnam. Of course, Vietnam, along with Iraq, the Iraq War in 2003, are considered the most unpopular wars. So today and the next lesson, you guys will be looking at why is that the case? Who's opposing the war? Why are they opposing the war? Today, we'll look at this idea of the credibility gap and why the credibility gap starts to grow in the late 1960s as the Vietnam War escalates. So let's get jumping right into this. So, what is a credibility gap, and what does this credibility gap refer to? So, a credibility gap, credibility, the idea of trustworthiness. The credibility gap is just the idea that there's a difference between what people say is the truth and what is the actual truth of a situation. So, in the 1960s, as the Vietnam War escalated, mainly due to LBJ after JFK's assassination and the Operation Rolling Thunder and the Gulf of Tonkin incident, he decides to escalate. And of course, the war was popular when it first gets started, but over time, obviously, people start to realize that LBJ and his officials may be lying, of course, or misleading the public about what is actually true about Vietnam. So the credibility gap was just this term used to describe uh, what the president was describing and what people thought was actually occurring, and then, as we'll talk about, what people knew was actually occurring in Vietnam. So, I mean, if you just look at like amount of troops the U.S. was sending, I mean, it's more than obvious that there's some important questions to be asked, which is if JFK had been involved in uh, overthrowing Diem in South Vietnam, and if LBJ was escalating the war, and by 1968, 500,000 troops were being sent to Vietnam. If LBJ keeps on saying that the war is winnable, why is this taking so long? And why were so many Americans being sent to fight in this foreign country in Southeast Asia? I mean, if World War II only took, the United States about 4 years to fight in, why was it taking 4 years to fight a country in Vietnam, that of course, a country in Southeast Asia most people hadn't heard of, in which people didn't think they had that strong of a military might, which they didn't, of course, but doesn't necessarily mean that the United States had an easy time winning, as you guys looked at in fighting. So why is this credibility? I just said crap. That's great. Credibility gap growing. So the most important reason is that the Vietnam War is the first war that is really a war on television. It's a war of television. It's considered the living room war because footage from Vietnam was shown nightly. And of course, this made it very hard for Americans to really accept the fact that the United States was winning or being told that we were winning and watching people get slaughtered. This very famous image from the right is from 1968, and it's a South Vietnamese general. You sick people can go find the actual footage of the live execution, but it was shown on actual news of this man is a suspected Viet Cong um, guerrilla, and he is executed. And of course, these kinds of images are very painful to see for Americans. So psychologically, they're trying to wrap their heads around the idea that Americans are being told by the president, "Oh, we're winning the war," and yet these awful images are coming across their television screen. Secondly, people started to become very outraged pretty early on about the tactics the United States were engaging in Vietnam. You guys will look more at this event called the My Lai Massacre, and what just awful war crimes are committed by Americans. And of course, that's one event we know of. I'm sure there are others that we don't know of that are now maybe becoming declassified, or that we'll just never know of in terms of really awful events. But of course, napalm and Agent Orange weren't exactly the most popular um, tactics to be using. Of course, as early as the 1966, even before the war was super unpopular, you had people who were extremely upset and angered by the idea of napalm being used. This is a 1966 protest outside of Dow Chemical in Michigan, where Of course, Dow Chemical was responsible for making napalm and Agent Orange, and you see these signs, very, very powerful signs of people who were very disgusted by what the U.S. government was engaging in, as early as the mid 1960s. Hey, 5 minutes 15 seconds, and I'm like almost halfway done, so let's do this. So that's a big part of this, is that this is on TV. People are upset about the tactics. You also have a major event that occurs in 1968 as the war is really at its climax, and that is an event called the Tet Offensive. So Tet is a Vietnamese New Year. It's a holiday, and both sides of the U.S. and the South Vietnamese, as well as the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong, agree to a truce. And essentially, that does not occur. And the Viet Cong launched this massive offensive attack on South Vietnam in hundreds of towns and small hamlets and villages. And they also stormed the U.S. Embassy, which was shown on news, and of course made Americans very fearful about people fighting there, as well as just this idea that Americans were being told that the war was being won, and yet the groups that we were fighting were launching an offensive attack. That's not a good sign. The interesting thing about the Tet Offensive was that the Americans and the South Vietnamese actually won the Tet Offensive. I mean, within a month, the U.S. and the South Vietnamese forces were able to prevent stop the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese from entering into South Vietnam. It's a victory technically for the U.S. and South Vietnam, but the event for 1 month kind of lingered in Americans' minds that somehow Americans were being told that they're winning this war, and yet Americans are on defense. I mean, you have live images of the U.S. Embassy in Saigon today, Ho Chi Minh City. In Saigon, in South Vietnam, you have 5 American, what's that word? What is that word? Diplomats, emissaries who are killed. So, this is starting to bring into question, is this war really winnable? What is happening? Why are we being told, or why are Americans being told that we're winning when it doesn't seem like that on television and based on what we're learning? And then really the worst event, or at least the worst moment for the U.S. government, maybe it was a good moment for Americans, is the publishing of what are called the Pentagon Papers. So the Pentagon, of course, is the U.S. Department of Defense's central hub in Arlington, Virginia, right outside of D.C. And the Pentagon Papers were a 7,000-page study that Daniel Ellsberg very famously leaked to the New York Times. So essentially, Defense Secretary Robert McNamara, he orders the Defense Department to make him a study of everything the U.S. had been doing in Vietnam from 1945 to 1968 up to that point. Of course, he didn't plan on having this revealed. This was highly, highly secret information that he, of course, would never want the public to learn about. And Daniel Ellsberg, who's so upset about what's happening in Vietnam and was covering Vietnam and working in Vietnam, he thought that this war was truly unwinnable and that the American government had just been simply lying and misleading people. So he decides to very, very controversially leak this 7,000-page document. Of course, the Pentagon Papers is its own bizarre, interesting story. The Defense Department sues the New York Times for even publishing it. The New York Times, in fact, wins under First Amendment right, claims that the press has a freedom of to publish information. Ultimately, why the Pentagon Papers really matter is that it really erodes any idea that the government was being truthful about Vietnam. The document laid out that the United States had been involved since the end of World War II in Vietnam. It laid out that LBJ's bombing campaigns in Rolling Thunder were very ineffective. Essentially laid out that LBJ was just extremely shameful in misleading not just the public, but Congress for years and years and years about the ability to actually win in Vietnam. So all these things, living room war, the growing use of anger, the growing anger over the use of napalm and other war atrocities leads Americans to be very upset about the war. Hey, 942. So if you have any questions, let me know. I can explain anything a little further. So before you guys finish the reading activity on the My Lai massacre, what I want you to do is to just pick out 2 of the things I just discussed and just explain couple sentences. These two major reasons why the credibility graph. God, I did it again. The credibility gap was growing by the late 1960s. Next lesson, you guys will look more at who was opposed to the war and some of the really, really insane political things that start to occur, in the 1968 election over the Vietnam War. So we'll talk soon enough. I hope all you guys are doing well. Miss you all. Adios.